Okay, great. Let's get started. So, welcome everyone to our compliance check-in, our office hours for May. We are going to be talking about compliance, the Title II deadline, the Title II deadline update, OCR complaints, and all of that really fun stuff. For any of you who are new to this group, I am Emily Popek, Vice President for Strategic Communications at Nichols Strategies. We're a small but mighty public relations firm that specializes in working with schools, school districts, and other local education agencies. And this professional learning community has been running for almost a year and a half now, talking about the issue of digital accessibility in school communications. So we're going to start with a little presentation and then we'll have a little discussion. Our big topic today is the recent change in the deadline for the federal Title II update. We'll talk about that first. And I thought, as I'm talking about the issue of compliance and enforcement and regulation, we're going to take a little detour into just talking generally about what we know about enforcement of this issue at a federal level, because I don't think we've ever talked about that as a group today. And if any of you have lived through an OCR complaint, I hope you will share your perspective as we have our discussion to close us out today. I'm going to leave a lot of time for discussion today because I want us all to be able to process our feelings about this new deadline and talk about where our organizations are with regard to compliance. Because I think this concept of complying with this aspect of Title II is resonating differently in different organizations. So even though we know compliance is not the only reason we do this work, it is going to be our focus just for today to talk about things through that lens of compliance. I'm hoping that this Zoom overlay will not block my slides for the whole time, but we'll see. All right, so let's get started. We're going to start with a vibe check first of all and see how we are feeling about this sudden and at least a little bit unexpected federal ruling that changed the compliance deadline. So let's see some numbers in the chat. How are you feeling about the latest federal ruling on this very scientific scale of objects that look like they have faces? Are you as grouchy as this very sad Michael Kors backpack? He's having a really bad day. I know a lot of accessibility advocates right now are one, they're feeling very frustrated by this delay, but you might be as delighted as this beautiful red onion, feeling just like relieved and like, you know what, we needed this. So thank you for sharing your feelings in the chat. Some of us are feeling many things. Maybe you are this tower that looks like a chicken, and you are also a hopeful cheese grater. So um it's a lot of feelings, right? I shouldn't have been surprised that the deadline changed, but I was still a little surprised. I was surprised it happened so close to the actual deadline. I don't like it when things change. That's the form of my personal anxiety takes. So I found it just shocking that uh, this change happened so close to the actual deadline. And I know for some of you who have state regulations, this kind of doesn't matter, right? Because you are dealing with your own state level guidelines that really mean you're already in this work. And what the federal government's doing does not necessarily change it. So let's talk a little bit to start with about compliance timelines and deadlines, if I can get my slides to advance. Here we go. And talk about what has happened and how that might impact you. And again, I'm just talking at the federal level here. I know some of you have different state regulations, but for the purposes of this group today, we're just going to be talking about federal stuff. So let's start with the facts of what happened. Once a journalist, always a journalist, right? You're going to get a nut graph first. So on April 17th, the U.S. Department of Justice pre-filed an interim final rule related to the Title II update that had initially been announced back in 2024, which set this whole thing in motion. You may recall that that initial 2024 update to Title II was also issued as a final rule. So that's where this language comes from. What happened in April 2026 was an interim final rule, sort of updating, or you might say superseding what was done back in 2024. And this interim final rule that came down back in April proposes to, quote, revise the regulations implementing Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act to extend the compliance dates for the requirements for web content and mobile apps that were adopted in 2024. So, as someone pointed out in the chat, and you can tell by this language, this interim final rule is proposing moving the compliance deadlines. And there's a public comment period that they're going to take public comment and review whether these deadlines should or should not change. But because this interim rule came down so close to what had been previously stated as the deadline, we're kind of in this, limbo zone right now where we're working under the assumption that these new deadlines will be going into effect. So the deadlines that had been announced back in 2024 would now be extended by 1 year. So if your original compliance deadline was April 2026, it would now be 2027. If your original compliance deadline was April 2027, it would now be April 2028. It's a lot of dates. And again, like most federal regulations, this one comes with a public comment period. So that 60-day comment period opened up the day this was published, April 17th. And that comment period will remain open through midnight Eastern Standard Time on June 22nd, 2026. So if you want to weigh in on this, this is your opportunity to do so. And I know a lot of folks in the disability advocacy space have been encouraging people to comment during public comment. That's what the public comment period is for. So that's what happened. Now, the question is, why did this happen? What do we know about why this happened? The interim final rule provides a lot of information about the why. So here are some of the highlights. The main reason these deadlines were extended seems to have been as a result of advocacy and pushback from a few different corners. Some of it was from higher ed. Some of it came from elementary and secondary education. You might be interested to know that AASA, the Superintendents Association, is named in the final rule. And small cities and municipal governments also spoke up about this timeline. In the end, the department provided a few specific justifications for the deadline extension. The first was the one that we've all kind of been already talking about. The department acknowledged basically that, hey, this may not have been enough time for everyone to get their act together, right? They cited issues such as cost and the need for staffing or training as some of the reasons why the deadline should be extended. I will note that disability advocates took a dim view of this justification. Many people argued back that 2 to 3 years is actually probably a pretty reasonable period for entities to have taken significant steps toward compliance. But regardless, I think many of us in this group have been feeling a lot of pressure to have gotten everything done by April 2026. Regardless, that's one of the reasons that was given. I think we can understand that, again, based on some of our own experiences. There are a couple other interesting justifications given that I honestly found to be a bit of a head scratcher. I'm going to try not to editorialize too much, but I will share some of these other reasons with you for your understanding. One of the other reasons given was the concern that using the WCAG standards specifically as a compliance standard would not be appropriate because the WCAG standards are constantly being written and revised. However, as advocates pointed out, the interim rule specifically accounted for that already. And it said, we're going to put a pin in this and just say you have to comply with version 2.1, period. But this interim rule said that's not good enough. We really can't have a standard that continues to change over time. So that's an interesting wrinkle and one that I would expect to hear more about moving forward. The interim rule did not discard the idea of the WCAG standards altogether. It doesn't propose any alternative, so it's not really clear where that aspect of it will go from here. The third reason the interim rule expresses concern that implementing this rule could expose state and local governments to some sort of almost like malicious style of attack from overseas agents who would attempt to disrupt government operations by bombarding them with a bunch of complaints. Basically saying if we advertise to the whole world that this is happening, what's to stop one of our international enemies from flooding our state and local governments with nuisance lawsuits related to this issue? I don't entirely grasp the logic here, since we know and we have seen that state and local governments can already, right now today, be the subject of successful lawsuits related to digital accessibility. But there it is. Last thing they noted, there's a statement that this deadline needed to be extended because basically there was the sense that the technology had not yet developed to a point where remediation can successfully be automated. This point like sent the disability slash remediation community on fire. I know this has been a really frustrating point for advocates who are like, no kidding. Like we have been knowing that you cannot automate remediation. We know there needs to be a human in the mix. But there you have it. Again, that was one of the reasons that was cited, essentially saying technology is not there yet that would really facilitate organizations to do this work at scale. So we need to give it more time. It seems clear from these reasons that uh, some of these reasons would need to be revisited because just extending the deadline will not change some of these things, right? Extending the deadline does not change the nature of the WCAG standards. Extending the deadline will not remove this perceived threat of bad actors overseas. So we don't know right now how the Department of Justice proposes to address those specific concerns. Again, that's one of the things that this comment period is designed to point a way forward to. So very interesting stuff. These were not the justifications I was expecting to see, but what do I know? There you have it. There they are. So what does this mean for you? What can we take away from this deadline change? If you look at it one way, you could say that this does not actually change much because we know and we have known that our fundamental responsibility as covered entities under Title II has not altered at any point, right? The final rule aimed to provide specificity around what content had to comply and what compliance standard we needed to use, right? But our fundamental obligation, as the interim rule reminds us, to provide equal access to our programs, services, and activities is unaltered by either this interim rule or the prior 2024 final rule. That obligation has been constant and consistent since 1990. So enforcement actions are not necessarily going to wait for these deadlines. I was just reading a blog post the other day in response to the interim rule. This blog post pointed out that like there was just a lawsuit that wrapped up. It was a case against a state government. And in this case, the court ruled that the requirements for your website to be accessible exist right now. The state tried to push back and said, oh, wait, the final rule deadline has not gone into effect yet, but the courts rejected that argument. And I will quote, they said, extending the deadlines does not insulate covered entities from their existing Title II obligations, and it will not stop litigation. To that point, there was actually a rise in digital accessibility lawsuits at the federal level in 2025 before any of these deadlines went into effect. That was up more than 25% from the prior year. These tend to fluctuate a bit year over year. This is not an all-time high, but it did approach the peak that we had seen back in 2022. It's a total of more than 3,000 cases nationwide. It's still true that the vast, vast majority of these cases are not targeting K-12 education. Overwhelmingly, these lawsuits are targeting private sector businesses that fall under the public accommodation requirement. The education sector makes up only about 2% of lawsuits, and that figure includes public and private, it includes higher ed, it also includes ed tech. So we still have not seen any detectable rise in lawsuits targeting K-12 education. So the most likely avenue of recourse for enforcement continues to be complaints filed with the Office of Civil Rights of the Department of Education, or OCR complaints. So let's talk about those for just a minute. What do OCR complaints actually look like? What does enforcement through the Office of Civil Rights actually look like in practice? If you've experienced this yourself, please feel free to chime in the chat, share anything relevant from your experience. I'm just going to give you a brief overview of what this process looks like and what we know about it. So when we think about OCR complaints, this is a light overview of the process as it stands today. It all starts with someone filing a complaint, someone who has identified an issue or been impacted by a barrier of access in some way. That complaint goes to the Office of Civil Rights. They review the complaint and they determine, is there anything here, right? Do we agree that there might be a barrier of access? They will choose to either investigate that complaint further or they will dismiss it. If the Office of Civil Rights determines there might be something here, we need to investigate it, they will contact the covered entity and notify them that an investigation is being initiated. From that point forward, the remedy or the goal of this process is to establish a resolution agreement between the covered entity and the Office of Civil Rights. And I have an example of what that might look like on the next slide. You can find resolution agreements online. You can read them in your spare time, like I do for fun. They are all different, right? Because each of these covered entities is facing different issues. But I wanted to show you a snapshot of one of them so that you can see it's true, Brooke, I do, so that you can see the kinds of things that these resolution agreements contain. These resolution agreements do a few different things. First, they specify the actions that you're expected to take. Those include things like reporting out to the department. They set deadlines or timeframes for those actions, and they require agreement from the covered entity. This screenshot is from the most recent resolution agreement that a school district reached with the Office of Civil Rights. This was, by the way, in January of 2025. There have not been any resolution agreements published since that time. Have they reached any? We don't know because they kind of stopped putting these things on their website. This was the most recent one that we could access. You can see that the provisions of this agreement are pretty detailed and pretty extensive. There are a lot of things that this district is expected to do just within the first 30 days of signing this agreement, right? And it goes on from there. This particular resolution agreement gave the district just 8 months to completely address all of the barriers that had been identified in the complaint. But something else that's good to know about OCR complaints is that the scope of the resolution agreement may not necessarily be limited to the issue raised in the original complaint. What do I mean by that? I mean that someone might experience a barrier with one document or one web page, but once they start looking, they can look at anything. It's more like being audited, right? Once they open the lid and start looking around, they may identify a number of other things that they feel need to be addressed. There's kind of no carrot and no stick here, not exactly. The process is really just, they're just asking you, telling you to fix this stuff, and you're expected to say yes and then do it. However, I did find language that says, and I'm quoting here because I want to be precise, in cases where the Title II entity receives federal financial assistance, assistance termination is an enforcement option. I can't really expand on that because I don't have any examples to draw from. I could not find any instances where this has actually happened, where a school district was like, no, we're not going to do it. And the Department of Education was like, we're taking away all your money. I could not find any cases where that has actually happened. But it would appear as though that is an enforcement mechanism. If you know of a time when this happened, please let me know. My inbox is always open. But generally, the way these things go is that the covered entity does the things the Office of Civil Rights told them to do, and the issue is resolved. I have never personally been part of an OCR complaint. I've talked to a lot of people who have. From what I have heard, the Office of Civil Rights works with you. They want you to be successful, and that the process goes more smoothly for districts that have already begun taking steps in the direction of accessibility. It's about progress, not perfection. It's about being able to demonstrate that you are taking action, you are heading in the right direction, which is good, right? It's encouraging. One other challenging thing I have heard about OCR complaints is that we sometimes get conflicting advice from these resolution agreements. And I will say, this is one of the problems that the final rule was intending to solve. Because the situation we had before is that, this investigator would investigate this district and would tell them to do things this way. And then 6 months later, another investigator would investigate another district and it would tell them something a little bit subtly different about what they needed to do to reach compliance. It's sort of like, like reading case law, but the problem was it was not being centrally resolved in any way. So you had people sort of trying to read the tea leaves and like read these resolution agreements and be like, well, this one says you have to do this and that one says you had to do that. This is why they came out with the final rule, because they're like, listen, we need just one set of standards that everyone can follow. So the problem with sifting through these resolution agreements is that, you might get told in your resolution agreement that the Office for Civil Rights wants to see alt text for every image, full stop. So that's what you do. Someone else could argue, well, we actually have a bunch of images on our website marked as decorative. This kind of nuance, again, is part of the reason why the final rule identified an external independent standard for this stuff. So that it was less about this individualized advice that schools and school districts and state and local governments were getting, and more of a consistent standard. Something else we know about OCR complaints and the resolution agreement process is that there's flexibility within reason. So if you were to say, hey, listen, we've been working on making these 100 PDFs accessible, but we ran into an issue. It's going to take us a little longer. We're probably only going to have half of them done by next month, and it's going to take us another couple months to get the rest done. From everything I have heard, I have every reason to believe that in that scenario, the OCR would be like, okay, do your best, keep at it, and you would keep going. But what I would also say is that knowing and doing are not the same thing. And the OCR will call you on that. Much like when my 14-year-old tells me that she was just about to put away her clean laundry, I do not think the Office of Civil Rights will be impressed by covered entities that are like, oh yeah, we were going to fix those PDFs, but we haven't actually done anything yet. I don't think that is going to help you. So any actions you can take, any steps you can take in the direction of accessibility, I encourage you to document those because that will help your case if you do find yourself in this situation of facing a complaint. So, what do we know about enforcement actions over time? We know a fair amount, but there are some holes in our knowledge. You'll notice that this chart on my screen ends in 2024 with a big question mark. According to a government oversight report that was issued last year, the Office of Civil Rights has not updated its list of open investigations since January of 2025. Does that mean they haven't opened any investigations? We don't know. The Office of Civil Rights also used to issue annual reports, and in those reports, they would log the number of complaints they received and in what categories, which is where we get some of this data from. But they did not issue a report for 2025, so we don't have up-to-date numbers. Here's what I can tell you. We can see from this chart that enforcement of digital accessibility complaints at school districts by the Office of Civil Rights has waxed and waned over time, right? As has the volume of complaints that they are receiving. There was this huge spike of complaints in the late 2010s, and that was partly due to an activist movement that was really targeting this issue in particular. A handful of people, one woman specifically, filed hundreds of complaints against school districts across the country, and a lot of those complaints were resolved during that period of 2017 to 2018. There was some pushback after that period, and a lot of that large volume of complaints got sort of put on ice while the OCR kind of regrouped around this issue. So again, we can see that these issues sort of wax and wane over time, and some of that has looked different with different administrations. How much of a priority is this at the federal level in any given moment? I can tell you that you see this little uptick in 2023, 2024. This was an issue at that time that administration was putting some focus on. They were actually doing some proactive enforcement. They were going out and looking at web properties that there hadn't even been complaints on. But these things change as administrations change in Washington. We don't have numbers yet for 2025, but here's what we do know. We know the Department of Education laid off a lot of its staff in 2025, right? We also know that a lot of those layoffs were in the Office for Civil Rights. We know that from March to September of 2025, the OCR resolved over 7,000 complaints in total, not just related to this particular issue, but total number of complaints. And about 90% of those were resolved via dismissal, meaning they were not investigated. That's a significantly higher proportion compared to prior years of complaints that were dismissed without investigation. So looking at this trend line, looking at what the OCR has been doing over the past year or so, we can say that right now enforcement and even just investigation of OCR complaints is in general at an extremely low level. And this is partially, Tony, in answer to your question in the chat. I don't have a crystal ball, but there is no indication at this point that when we do reach the compliance deadline that there is going to be any type of surge in enforcement actions. There's just no indication pointing in that direction right now. And in fact, I would argue that the indicators right now appear to point in the opposite direction, that there's not a tremendous appetite in the Department of Education right now to enforce around this particular issue. Again, I'm going to refrain from editorializing further, but I think this data is interesting and I wanted you to have it. I wanted to share it with you, and we'll talk about it all in a minute. Before we switch over to the discussion portion of our session today, I did just want to take a look forward and highlight what's coming next for our PLC. Whoops, I can't control these slides. We are going to meet in June, just like we did last year, to celebrate our wins and look ahead to our goals and talk about our plans for the coming school year or for the summer, that mythical time when we like to imagine that we'll get everything done that we put off during the school year, right? This was a really fun session last June, so I'm really looking forward to it again this year. We usually don't meet as a group over the summer, but if you're going to be at the NSPRA seminar, I would love to connect. I would love to do a little PLC meetup in real life. So I will send out a little quick poll to find out who from this group is going to be in New Orleans this summer to see if we can informally get together. I know the schedule is always super packed, but I would love to hang out with some of you guys in person if we have the chance. I might throw some office hours in August, so watch your inboxes for that, but we probably won't have another formal meeting with a presentation until September. As I mentioned last month, I'm in the process right now of planning my fall sessions. So if you have an idea, a request, an offer, please let me know. I'd love to do more co-hosting. I'd love to do more case studies and things like that in this group. Maybe we'll have a show and tell session in the fall. What do you guys think about that? I would love to do some show and tell. For those of you who are watching the recording, thank you for tuning in. And for those of you who are here with me live today, I'm going to stop the recording so we can have a little chat about all this.